It's often assumed that if the author of Genesis 1:1 intended for us to read this verse as a dependent clause, this is because he, like others in the ancient world, took for granted that the material world has always existed. Thus, when the biblical author spoke of God creating heaven and earth, what he meant is that God reordered or reorganized the pre-existing matter into what then became the heavens and the earth, not that he brought the matter into existence for the first time. On this understanding, the doctrine of creation ex nihilo could not be inferred from Genesis 1:1, and in fact is entirely ruled out. I think that this kind of claim goes beyond the evidence. Even if it were true that the author intended for us to read Genesis 1:1 as a dependent clause, we could not infer from this that he regarded the material world as eternal. We don't know enough about what the biblical author, or people in the ancient world more generally, believed about the origins of the material world to say that they regarded it as eternal. The doctrine of the eternality of matter seems to have been developed by the Greeks during the classical period. The doctrine cannot, in any case, be traced back to the ancient Near East, much less to the Hebrew Bible. So, if it were to be granted that creation ex nihilo cannot be inferred from Genesis 1:1, the default interpretation should not be that the biblical author believed in the eternality of matter. That would be just as anachronistic as it would be for someone to read the doctrine of creation ex nihilo into the text, assuming here for the sake of the argument that the text does not already imply some tacit understanding of the doctrine of creation ex nihilo. At most, an intellectually honest interpreter, who also thinks that Genesis 1:1 ought to be read as a dependent clause, could say that since this verse seems to take for granted the pre-existence of matter, it shouldn't be read as support for the doctrine of creation ex nihilo. In that case, someone who bases his theological beliefs on the Bible could still believe that God created the world ex nihilo, and could justify this belief by appealing to other biblical texts. This is something, for example, that Michael Heiser did. One could just not infer this doctrine from Genesis 1:1. Now, it's commonly alleged that before the 2nd century AD, no one believed in the doctrine of creation ex nihilo. Yet the literary and archaeological evidence for this historical claim is by no means self-evident. For example, several Babylonian texts arguably teach or presuppose that the material world had been created ex nihilo. I think that modern commentators and historians often sell the peoples of the ancient Near East short when they suggest that these peoples never reflected on whether or not the material world had come into being at some point. Most people, even young children, are thoughtful enough to wonder when the world was created or came into existence. They don't just naturally assume that it has always existed. So again, we can't just beg the question and presume that before the doctrine of creation ex nihilo had been formally articulated in whatever you want to say, the 2nd century or whatever, that no one would have ever thought about it or believed in it. If we accept that the author of Genesis 1:1 meant for us to read the verse as a dependent clause, exegetically, this would not necessarily mean that the earth in verse 2 had already been in existence before God began his creative acts. Let me illustrate what I mean. Here's a dependent temporal clause. In the beginning, when I was making my bed, the sheets were a mess. Here the bed is understood to have existed before I began to make it. So in the temporal clause, when I was making my bed, it's obviously assumed that I was reordering or reorganizing my bed, not bringing it into existence for the first time. But now consider another dependent temporal clause. In the beginning, when I was painting this picture, there were no buildings, no trees, only a blue backdrop. Here it's clear that the houses and the trees didn't exist before I painted them. All there was a blue backdrop. and one couldn't infer from this sentence that the blue backdrop had always existed. In fact, you would probably be safe to assume that I myself had painted that blue backdrop. But whether that were true or not, fixating on the blue backdrop would surely detract from what I was trying to say. I said what I did in the way that I did in order to underscore that the painting was my own work. Whether I or someone else painted the blue backdrop is beside the point. I only mentioned the blue backdrop because I wanted to describe how I had produced the painting, and I needed some kind of jumping off point. After having mentioned the blue backdrop, I could then proceed to tell you about how I went about painting the houses, trees, and other objects on the canvas. Okay, so these are just a few comments that I wanted to make before proceeding with more videos. In the next video, I'll discuss how Genesis 1:1 has been traditionally understood, and we'll be looking at lots of ancient translations and interpretations. After that, I'll offer a critique of certain non-traditional interpretations of this verse.